Let us be passionate until the end, instead of spending our days and nights haunting our own homes like defanged draugr. To have breath left in our lungs is victory. How can so many of us give up so prematurely before we've even tried to pick up our swords?
Salutations and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we're so excited to discuss Sigrun and the Mist with Jack Grayle and Klara Wolfe. I know so many listeners are familiar with Jack Grayle, who is, among many other things, an author, a ceremonial magician, a practitioner, and teacher of the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, as well as the esoteric aspects of Homer's classic epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and a long-time devotee of Hecate. But in addition to all of that, did you know that Jack is a playwright who grew up in the theater, and his latest tome is a fantastic verse play set 1,200 years ago in heathen Norway entitled Sigrun and the Mist. The play tells the story of a fallen Valkyrie named Sigrun and a Manx pirate who calls herself the Mist. Within the pages of Jack's play, it has just so much. It includes excellent commentary on Norse myth and cultural context from Shani Oates, a retelling of the original Icelandic myth Jack's play is based on, and also the lead role of Sigrun is brought to life with remarkable images courtesy of photographer Nicola Hofstikler, and the model in those photos is Klara Wolfe, who writes in the book about the transformative power of embodying this fallen Valkyrie, Sigrun. In addition to modeling Sigrun, Klara is an occult writer, an instructor, a practitioner, and so much more. She's also a professional embalmer, specializing in major reconstructive and pediatric cases, and has handled over 4,000 embalmings. Her spiritual practice focuses on the folk magic of Norse and Germanic traditions, and she has published on these topics in Sigrun and the Mist, as well as the upcoming anthology Triple Goddess, her chapbook The Maiden with No Hands, and her personal account of the embalming trade, The Dismal Art. Today, we head to the far north to dive deep into Sigrun and the Mist and discuss future projects and collaborations with both of our guests. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Jack Grayle and Klara Wolfe. Jack Grayle and Klara Wolfe, thank you both so much for taking some time and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you so much.
I feel excited after that intro.
I know. Oh my goodness. I'm blushing over here. It's so lovely to be here, Alex. Thank you.
Alex.
Well, the honor, of course, is certainly mine. Are you kidding me? I mean, just to, of course, chat with both of you and just your wonderful paths and intertwinings, but also because this play, Sigrun and the Mist, was not only in Denis Poisson's top 10 occult books of 2024 on his excellent Foolish Fish YouTube channel, but in the top 3 occult books of last year. So
yes, congratulations.
I can't complain about being edged out by Alan Moore. I'll have to just accept my fate there.
Seriously.
Such a powerful accomplishment for both of you and everyone who we're going to get into involved in Sigrun and the Mist. I think many listeners might be interested in hearing about how each of you not only met each other, but also can you share about your early background and early experience with not only theater, but also the importance of using the medium of a play as a venue for esoteric wisdom.
I'll just jump in and say you're the reason we met, Alex. I met Klara in one of my TGM courses, and together we've collaborated on ever since, and it's been a pleasure, but it's largely because, you help promote my work, and through that, we're able to meet, and I was like, who's this person that keeps posting these fascinating insights about the dead and, the spirits of those who've passed, and treating them with respect and not being terrified of normal humans that have passed their allotment of life. And gradually I asked her, where are you getting all this knowledge? And she's like, well, funny story.
It's true. As soon as I heard the podcast, I think it was Jack's first podcast on here, I immediately remember just thinking, I have to take this guy's class. I loved everything you said and the way that you said it, and just your regard for the ecstatic and the beautiful and everything in between. And it comes through in every single thing you do.
It shows the power, too, of getting together. That's the thing. Like, as much as social media drives you crazy, when you have these online groups and you have these get-togethers, you not only get people from all over the world, but I never would have met someone who embalmed 4,000 people. Like, the insights I've gotten her, are invaluable, especially since much of the magic, as you guys know, in antiquity is spirit-driven. It's ghost-fueled. It's powered by the dead. And to some degree, the magicians, mages, priests back then were working with the spirits of those who'd passed was a large part of what they did and how they did their magic, which people don't realize now. And I never would have gained the insights I did before I began talking to you, That goes too for, I know you and I have met people in these courses who practice North African magic in a tradition, people from Brazil who have living traditions of magic, people from Asia that, they'd every day of their lives is just steeped in spirit work and ancestral work.
Absolutely.
In ways that we can't even guess in the West. And I just want to say, it's been such a privilege, too, to meet in these groups and work with these people, not just because, I'm teaching a class, but often the material is just like the jumping off point for a conversation. And when people start to talk back, it's like, oh my God, like you get a crash course in other cultures and other traditions and other careers that really can open your eyes. And this was one of the best and biggest examples of that, your work, with the dead.
I have never seen an online community that compares to these groups of your students. It really, really is just, there are these remarkable pockets of inspiring, strange, like diverse, unique people that I, like Jack said, I never would have met. And I will also say that I have practiced on my own for most of my life and kind of eschewed, the mass culture at hand. And I was really on my own for so long. I'm one of those ridiculous kids that came out of the womb and said they were a witch. And my family encouraged me and really bought into that along with me. I made a conscious decision to sort of dip into the occult world. And I have no idea. I wish I could remember how I stumbled on Glitch Bottle. But it was this remarkable, survey of so many brilliant people. But when I heard Jack speak, I just knew that I was supposed to be there. And really, I cannot gloat enough about, the friends and companions that I've met in these classes too. If anyone is looking for a community and wants to reach into the void and, see who and what is out there, I highly encourage them to take any of Jack's classes.
Oh, I'm glad you said it. There's a different thing too, though. And this, like we're talking about the arts. And a lot of times what you find out is people talk about their esoteric practice first, but then all of a sudden you start to see their work and you're like, oh my God, this woman's a sculptor. Then the next one, like, oh my God, look at the pictures she drew. This is fantastic. And someone else, she does like burlesque, and another person, they do, they do all these kind of weird, they play like, oh my God, he toured with that band. Oh my God. People reveal everything from the meals they cook. And all of a sudden you realize they're steeped in craft, but it's the art of craft. You know what I mean? Like they're not just witches, mages, priests, whatever. There's this flow of creativity. And the magical rituals are one aspect of this outflow, but they also, write poetry, and they also dance with the local troupe, and they also, and even the ones that don't have that hunger about them, and you can see how excited they get when they see someone say, how did you learn to do that? Did you take a class? Where did you get this? And you realize that everyone's an artist, and everyone has that artistic impulse deep inside. And if we're lucky, we got to express it as kids in some ways, or we grew up in a household where it was welcome or where there were resources to allow for it. But a lot of people, it gets tamped down, certainly after high school, it sort of drops off. They may, scribble a few verses in the privacy of their bedroom, but they're kind of, quote, done being artists. Then magic is a way back into art. It is an art, A-R-T-E, but it is an art itself. And how often have you seen people design an outfit and timing and an altar, the way they dress, the food they prepare, the design they do, they sculpt the god, the way they gather, whether it's a minimal approach or whether it's Baroque and elaborate and extra. But you can see them expressing their creativity and their artistry through magic. And magic is often a door, I think, not just to the divine, but to the divine in ourselves that allows us to express through creativity that stream of art wherein we express what it is to be human and how we connect with other people by conveying something of truth regarding the human condition, which we all have experienced differently, and yet there's deep strains of sympathy through what we feel and how we feel it.
Klara, just to return to your background too, for many of the listeners who might be learning about you for the first time. So you came out of the womb and you said, I'm a witch. And you obviously, in your as a professional embalmer, there are definitely heavy elements, of course, of, respect for the dead, these kind of chthonic weavings. But can you tell us, some of the broad strokes about how you got into deeper and deeper into esotericism, into witchcraft, into, solitary work or, research, all of those things? Was it truly from childhood on? Was there one particular moment that you remember that solidified things for you, or was it just kind of a gradual process?
I feel so blessed to have had almost this feral experience growing up of really being able to spend a lot of time outdoors, a lot of time. I was an extremely bookish child, obsessed with poetry and literature. And I truly did just spend most of my time outside listening and just getting into whatever I possibly could. And always from the very beginning, like I said, I was very lucky that my mother and my grandmother recognized magical talent in me and really corroborated my magical experiences and dreams. So I was encouraged there, which is not a very common experience for a lot of people. I was always just encouraged to be strange and creative and pursue whatever I wanted to do. I have had a lifelong love affair with death, I will say. That started, I think, immediately. I have no explanation for that, really. Death has been a very constant force in my life. And I went to art school first and was a painter. I never did any theater. I do not have a theater background. I've done some performing as far as reading poetry, reading writing, and modeling. But I focused on painting, fine arts, usually pretty bleak landscapes. And then, when it came time for me it felt like everything fell into place. I just realized, all the skills that I had been building. But this entire time, I felt like I was really called towards the death current. And that more than anything, when I step into the prep room, there really is no separation there between my magical life and my professional life. I mean, my first commitment is always to the spirit of the person, the decedent that I'm working on. And it's very rare that I'm going to be working on a decedent that's like, a Thelemite or something, right? Most of them are within the Christian paradigm, still in funeral service or, with no heavy overtones of faith. But using these modes that you can see from the PGM, from Greco-Egyptian work and writings, from Peter Jenks's Thai occult, these same ways of approaching the dead are universal, of just, appealing to them, respecting them, giving them something. What can I say? Every day to be steeped in that, it's a true privilege. And if I were to go and recount, every moment that I've felt spirit presence or heard something or felt something, it would take days. It really, really that more than anything upgraded my certainty and the reality that the spirits are around us and that they do come when we speak to them and they hear us.
Thank you for sharing that, Klara. And I truly appreciate that. And I know the listeners do as much as I do, because that's incredibly heavy. It's saturnine. It's ancient. It is one of the oldest tasks and one of the oldest procedures that goes back before written history. And it's very powerful for you sharing that. Thank you. What I notice about collaborators is they often tend to balance each other out with their great gifts. And so your great gifts are balanced out with Jack Grayle, who literally, Jack, you say on page, oh gosh, it must be page 3, that you literally, I love theater. You say, quote, I love theater. I grew up surrounded by it. One of my earliest memories is being on tour with my parents as they performed a production of The Rainmaker through West Texas. Can you tell us, for the listeners who are very familiar with the Hecatian, very familiar with your work with Homer's The Odyssey and the Iliad, very familiar with the work, of course, with the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, many might not know exactly how deeply enmeshed you were and are in theater. Can you tell us about your background a little bit with that?
Oh, sure. Well, I just, my parents were actors and directors, and I grew up, I would attend their opening nights, or they'd go on tour, and I'd be brought with them when I was a little kid. When they would instruct students, I'd watch them, and gradually I picked it up, and I was inserted in a few shows when young, and I was awful, and then, had to learn, basically learn how to do it as I grew up. You realize it's a lot easier to judge how other people do it than to do it yourself, like most things. Like it's so easy to decide what other people are doing wrong, and it's so hard, to do it right. But
Truly.
my parents were good teachers, and they encouraged people. I'll never forget this, to see them. They always encourage people to follow their instincts and their intuition. They said, if you do that, it'll be natural. Don't ignore your inner voice, because inevitably what comes out will seem false to the audience. When you respond, even if what it's telling you would seem to run contra to the script or the character, if you have an impulse, follow it, because that impulse is coming from a deeply human place. And when we go to see theater, we go to watch human beings and discover something about what it is to be human, So I love theater. It's fun. It's often awful, but when it's great, there's nothing better. There's something so old-fashioned about gathering to watch a bunch of people pretend to be someone else, to have a bunch of people sort of collectively agree to suspend disbelief and enter that world, even if there's no budget and no props and very little costumes and everything, minimal production values. If it's done truthfully, you lose yourself in their world, and you think of yourself as one of them, and you can be moved to tears or laughter by what you see on the stage, I love that. And I trained as a Shakespearean actor, and I trained in different places, and I had different teachers here and there. One of them briefly was Vanessa Redgrave, and I've acted in London and New York and Chicago, and been on tour all through the Midwest and New England, playing venues, as big as, big professional theaters, and as small as I performed in malls and elementary schools and church basements and cafeterias and things like that. So some of these were kind of rough and tumble productions, but I grew to kind of love that. I love sort of scrappy, underfunded artistic endeavors. And I've never lost that feeling. And I've never lost the fact that even when, it's just 10 of us, everyone's playing 4 roles, the costume budget was $145. You're waving swords made of wood. If it's a great play, if you let them hear it, if you don't do too much to it, if you don't gild the lily, if you don't trick it out, you can move people to tears or laughter. Like they enter the world. The language itself is enough to let people enter the world. So it made sense later when I came to magic, when they talk about the god Thoth creating reality with speech and how you speak and it becomes, or the magician creating a world. Because that's, of course, the magic circle is like a world, and the magician's at the center of it. And when it says Alpha and Omega, literally by his feet, it doesn't take a large leap of imagination to understand the role the magician has in the circle. He's creating in microcosm what has been created for him or her in macrocosm. And his words, or her speech, his conjurations, her evocations, they create reality. But that's what an actor does too. When an actor walks on stage and says, well, Jed, it's been 3 days since you're married, a reality is created, a or when someone puts her on stage, puts her hands in her face and says, "Mom, I'm pregnant," a reality is created. And even though you know they're actors reciting a speech, you feel this pang inside as you watch them if it's done truthfully. And all of a sudden, you're not in the audience anymore. You're sitting next to them. Their words are coming out of your mouth, and you're hearing what they're hearing. And you're them, and they're you. And there's a strange illusion between the watcher and the watched, and the two become one. It's truly a mystical experience in the best of ways, but it's something you only get, if you attend it or if you create it. And it's magical. It really is in the general sense, but I think in a specific way too. It's easy to forget, the first theatrical productions in the West were at the Theater of Dionysus in Athens at the foot of the Parthenon. You can go see it. It wasn't even a big theater, but you can actually stand there where theater came to be formally as a way to honor Dionysus. It has a magical, deistic, celebratory, divine root.
Jack, let me start with you. How did you first conceive of Sigrun and the Mist? And what is, for the listeners who might not know, this 14th century romance piece, The Lay of Egil and Asmund, and how do the two relate? What was the genesis of this play?
Oh, sure. I've always loved heathenry and Norse myths and magic. I just think there's really nothing better. They're magnificent by any standard, and they have so much to teach us, and they are adjacent to people like the Greek and Roman tales, the three Norns mirroring the three faiths. There's overlap as the cultures themselves overlapped, because of course the Norsemen traded throughout, they have beads from Egypt, discovered in Norwegian graves, and they have, Norwegian traders would travel through Russia and as well as down to North Africa and Spain and all that. So in their world intermingled. But there's a bunch of really great short stories from the Icelandic folklore. And there's one called Egil and Asmund, which is a great story about two friends who are hired by a king to go find his two daughters that have been kidnapped by his wife, a queen who was part giantess, who turned into a dragon and flew off with them. So I really loved this story, but I thought I wanted to set myself a challenge. And I was like, I wonder if I could write this play in iambic verse, like Shakespeare did. It was like a what-if scenario. And I thought, you know what? I've done a lot of
fun does.
No, but you know what? I've done a lot of plays. Like I've played Cassius and Julius Caesar. I've played Macbeth and Macbeth. I've played Orlando and As You Like It. I've played Pericles and Pericles. I've played a bunch of others. And I've just I kind of know that paradigm. And I thought, I wonder if I could do it. But I thought, well, what if I mixed it up? Because I want to just do it literally. I don't want to follow it literally. So I thought one of the ways I'd mix it up is by changing the gender of the protagonist. So I thought it would be cool to have two female warriors go to save two princes that had been kidnapped. And the short story itself, which has all kinds of weird little Lacunian things, it does mention a Valkyrie. So I thought I'll make one of the main characters the Valkyrie, and I'll make the other one, who is a pirate in the main story, but I'll make her a pirate too, a pirate from Manx called the Mist. And so I just sort of set myself the challenge, could this be done? Could I do it? And I thought, I'm going to give it a shot, because here's the thing. I really do believe that if you're in touch with your gods and your people, your spirits, whatever they are, whether you think of them as outside agents or internal archetypes, if you're in touch with them, and if you feed them, I think it creates kind of a fire that expresses itself from within creatively in some ways. And I thought it was almost a challenge to them as well as me to say, let's see if we can do this. Let's see if we can work together to make this happen. And you know what's nuts? It was the easiest thing I ever wrote. I think it just kind of came out. It was nuts. There was hardly much revision at all. A lot of essays I've written, 20 pages long, took much more work and revisions than Sigrun and the Mist. But part of it, here's the thing. Part of it was because it was in verse. It's on iambic pentameter, which, is the same verse scheme that Shakespeare used. It's a 10-beat rhythm and with an iamb, which mimics English speech and the sort of the heartbeat, the dump, the dump, the dump, the dump. And because it's in free verse, so it doesn't rhyme, but because it had a structure, it became easier to create because the structure itself provided a framework. And I've heard people say that too, Alex, when I was, researching Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and they talk about when you have a bardic tradition, bardic people can extemporize verse sometimes indefinitely. Kind of like how rappers can sort of, just go. But it helps to have a metered structure because that gives it a form, and you just fill the form. And if your imagination is clicking, and if the genius is whispering in your ear, and if the spirits are kind to you, it kind of comes out, it unspools. The story in a way tells itself. And I think everyone who's ever written knows that weird feeling where something clicks and the thing starts to tell itself. There's you trying to tell the story, and then half an hour in, there's one good line, and that's followed by a second good line, and all of a sudden it's effortless until the dog barks or the phone rings or you get called away, and something just happens, right? So that was part of the challenge. Could I engage in that way, and could I make it happen in a way that would be fun, in a way that people would enjoy, in a way that could be exciting or different? So I wish I had a more arcane explanation, but that was really it. I just wanted to create something beautiful and weird. It seems like I did.
The shocking thing, though, is, that really illustrates your ability to just let the muses have their way with you. Because when you read it, it's so, I'll say first off, when I read it, I really was brought to tears because, I've been such a nerd for, Nordic, Anglo-Saxon sagas and eddas, and it gets to a point where you run out of them. And when I read it, I just could not believe that somebody in our time made something. It seemed to just effortlessly, without any pretension, continue that same thread, so sincerely and so truly. I mean, it blew my mind. I feel like we didn't even have the conversation right away, Jack, but it was at some point when I asked you, how did you know to write about Sigrun like that? And you had no idea that there really was a Valkyrie named Sigrun. In the 14th century, there are folk charms and spells addressing her almost like a saint-like figure. And the way that he channeled her, I mean, it really gives me chills. He did an excellent job because Sigrun, as I said, she was an actual figure in Norse mythology. She appears, in the Elder Eddas and the Younger Eddas, and in a few other sagas. She has a very complex, like multiple reincarnations. And even the way that Jack wrote of, this particular storyline, it just rings so true to me that this could very well be one of her incarnations that he channeled without even trying, apparently, which is just gross. It's disgusting how talented you are.
I did try. I did try. You have to understand, everything's relative. Everything else I write, it's, there's a great description of writing. It says a writer is someone who sits down at a desk and opens a vein. And so that's what it feels like sometimes. You know what I mean? It feels like bloodletting. And, but this one felt marginally easier. I should say that. Marginally easier. Shall we?
I mean, there is nothing like it. There is nothing else like it. There really isn't.
Should we read part of the scene? We've been talking to people about, there's this great play. Then we'll read it and people are like, oh, hell, I didn't.
Please, both of you, please recite, because there is this incantatory, hypnotic effect that's just in every page of Sigrun the Mist that I think listeners will very much appreciate, both on a magical level and on simply just the enjoyment of the syntactical jubilations that are there. So yes, please.
Well, thank you. Okay, and so just as there's a bit of a spoiler here, but just for people who are listening to this scene comes at the very end of the play. It's a scene between the god Odin, who I'll read, and a scene between the pirate called the Mist, right, who's a Manx pirate. And this scene takes place to say Sigrun is the main character, but Sigrun, at the end of the play, dies by Odin's will. And her friend, Mist, who Klara's playing, is devastated. But when the act has happened, Odin addresses his other Valkyries and tells them to follow him as they're going to leave with the body. And Mist calls out to stop him. And this part of a scene is what happens next. This is the dialogue between them that deals with the discussion about why Sigrun died. And previously in the story, Sigrun has explained to Mist that she's doomed because the Valkyrie are supposed to remain sort of like the Vestal Virgins in ancient Rome. Their main function is to serve Odin, not to have romances and take lovers. And she broke that rule. And because of that, her doom is upon her and she can't avoid it. And so by the end of the play, she's not alive. Odin's responsible. And this scene happens between them.
Stay, destroyer, who in dark glory comes, to blind and deaf in mortal sense, and hear the words of one who is no child of yours, owes you no obedience, never prayed to you, and never will. Know this, night terror, war maker, life taker, the she that you have slain, though foolish in affections, was yet the fiercest fighter, fastest friend, to fight and feast the Midgard Vale.
I know her virtue, child, as I do her vice.
No, you cannot. For if you did, you never would have done such a deed. Know this, for the time we walked together, short as it was, I saw a soul that shone with a darkness unreachable, and reached for it in vain. Though ever in my company, Sigrun walked alone. Her separation from her former life was like a cut that never ceased to bleed. It was my one hope to find a way to bind that wound that ever bled, and now I never will.
That wound was mortal.
It serves your purpose to say so. But as counterfeit coins clink hollow, your words have the ring of wounded pride.
Child of man, approach.
I am the sea god's daughter.
You are no such thing, but the issue of a soldier and his unwed wife. And yet, my dark daughters, who bring me word of all warriors worth the name, have your name whispered more than once. If their reports are true, then you may hope in time for a place in my great hall, and then into the final field at the forefront of the godly ranks.
I would rather writhe upon a spit than serve the one who slew the noblest she I've ever known.
Woman, though you loved her like yourself, dispraise not her death, nor the constant logic of the gods. For the rules that bind the Aesir are stronger far than the pull of fear and hunger that repulse and tempt your kind. Behold, the daughter whom I killed, foremost of my harriers, and chief in my regard. I loved her mother very well, and her no less. Yet every life has purpose, which by its function is defined, and she abandoned hers. Should I ignore her lapse? If so, then I'd abandon mine. Such leniency would lead to discontent, and in time all my deathly brood would change their spears for bridal veils.
And if they did?
Then would the finest fighters' souls ungathered go, so that few or none would swell the godly ranks at Ragnarok, that final day when fate decrees the Aesir shall their shadow selves at last confront, and like the touch of rain to flame, each elemental force be fast extinguished by its twin.
Who cares how ghosts extinguish ghosts at the narrow end of time?
She did. And if you knew not that, you knew not her. It was her joy to fill my shining ranks with warriors worth the name. Her fall betrayed not only me, but herself.
And yet, you are as much to blame as she, for your rule was far too strict. Why should she not, after a term or two of working your will, enjoy the fruits of love like any other?
She was not like any other. She was Valkyrie. And I forged her and her sisters with the same care as did the dwarfs when they fashioned Gungnir, my heart-hungry spear. The flaw in Sigrun's metal requires fire and forge, so I will reheat, rehone her, and reset her edge to true. Rehammer her I will, and when I'm done, her new forged soul will cool into the flawless instrument that she was meant to be.
She was meant to be what she was, a woman who would live and love. She chose love over you, and you in jealous rage have killed her, and no philosophy, however lofty, can justify that fact.
I shall not try to justify a choice when there was none. I made no choice. Her act, her disobedience to me, was set in motion long before she learned to walk, and so was my revenge.
You knew that she would disobey.
Yes, or I would not have asked this one for the second favor.
You knew your daughter would defy her fate, yet never warned her not to do so?
Would have done no good had I told Sigrun every hour of the fate that Eren brought. Still she would have kissed him and earned the doom that that kiss brought.
How can you claim to see what never came to pass?
Behold, this eye can see all deeds done in this world. This void, deeds done in every other, including worlds whose names are could have been, and never was, and yet shall be.
No such eye have I, yet I see this, one who slew a falcon in her prime, for that she could not abide to be tethered to his glove.
No such eye had she either, yet she knew well what would follow from her fall, but not when. Her dying lasted 5 breaths. Her new-forged self will serve millennia more. Begrudge me not my methods, for death is just a doorway to a world that you know not, but never will.
Call it what you want. Her killing was cowardly and cruel, and if my words offend, then skewer me with the same spear that struck your daughter down.
Your fury for your friend commends you to my liking. We will meet again, but I will reap no reavers before their time. Farewell.
If you let me live, know that I am your enemy forever.
That puts you in good company. And as a parting gift, I give you consolation, a vision from my void eye shared. When yet your death time comes, Mist, and you draw your final breath, the Valkyrie who will reap your soul will be none other than that valiant she that we both love. Her form will be reforged, but you will know her just the same, and she you. And as her flaming steed bears you aloft through spheres of ice and fire, you two shall once again embrace and speak to one another as before.
You promise this?
I do.
Not easy for me to thank an enemy, the killer of my friend. And yet, I thank you. For you've removed the last remaining fear I felt for my approaching death. Now will I laugh at danger and think of war as sport, and wade into the fray unfettered by fear or hurt, or hope of staying whole. I shall not reach old age, knowing as I do that she awaits.
I know, and your exploits will fit you further for the legions of Valhalla.
I will never fight for you.
So many say, but time will tell. Farewell, Mist.
Farewell.
And scene.
I have no words except to say that when the scene began, I was sitting here recording a podcast with you, and I was immediately transported to this intense back and forth.
Oh.
And also, Jack, you know, Klara strikes me as honest in every way, but I think she was fibbing when she said she didn't have theater experience, because that was
Right?
a flawless back and I mean, really, that was so great. Is this how rehearsals go? Is this how the creative this was amazing.
It never goes this smoothly. I think we need to create the maybe we need to create the Sigrun The Mist radio play. Maybe that's what we should do. That would save fun. Be a lot cheaper than producing the whole thing, right? A 3-hour epic.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I need to ask both of you, because your lines were just so smooth. The back and forth. I remember reading this, but there's a difference in I reading it, just like when you're reading Shakespeare, and then seeing it performed. I think it's kind of two different realities, you know? Yeah. One of the things that I want to ask you, and I had to find the quote by Oscar Wilde when it comes to theater, I think, is, "Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask, and he'll tell you the truth." Klara, we're going to get to your physical embodiment of Sigrun in a bit, but let me ask you both here, to Oscar Wilde's point. When you're both in character and you're both going back and forth live and reading live and performing live, right? Can you tell us about the act of transportation? I mean, as a performer, what's going through your mind? Is it a direct, immediate embodiment? Is there kind of a kinetic verbal force that builds up? How does the back and forth go? I mean, what is it like to embody that?
I wasn't fibbing. This was my very first time, my first experience with anything theatrical. But I was really surprised how easy it was to step into it. I read over it several times, and the words are just so pertinent, and they curl around each other so generously. But I mean, I really found the themes of what, everyone in the play says, these themes of facing your doom and your death, so resonant for today, right now, where I think often we sort of passively take in the sufferings and all the bad news all the time, and we wring our hands about it, and we worry and we fret, and we have a hard time sort of just charging straight forward, to that doom, no matter what might come. And that's really, I think, why the paradigm, of choosing the Norse landscape makes it so, so perfect for right now. Because you have these people that they don't expect the world to be kind. They don't expect it to be anything other than it is. But they live out their fates fearlessly. And there's just something about, stepping into those words, saying those words, that you can't help but feel it. You just can't help it.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. What you just said, the world they live in, I had the ability to go to Iceland a year ago, and it was so true. The winds that would blow up, unforeseen, the sudden downpour, the incredible sudden drop in temperature, the crazy landscape that would be fertile fields one moment and just jagged fingers of glass-like lava the next. These stories come from a world where nothing could be taken to granted. Everything was volatile, literally fire and ice. I know there's volcanoes bubbling right now in Iceland and snow-capped peaks, and it's a world like where you feel caught between the elements. There's no wonder this idea of Asgard, Midgard, and then the underworlds, you can almost see them in that world, the lava flowing up from some unseen heated place, and beaches so hot you can't even walk on them without thick boots, and then strange fields and waterfalls. It's an elemental place. And to be in contact with those wild elements is to become elemental yourself. I think when Klara said earlier, she said something really revealing when she said, I spent a lot of time outdoors as a child. And I think anyone who's had a similar experience knows there's just, when you're young and you're out for much of the day around nature, you become attuned, I think, to a different world. You learn to listen more than you talk. You learn to realize that what you see isn't always what's there. You begin to feel presence, how places have presences that aren't always explicit because of what's on them. You grow to understand that certain aspects of the landscapes are friends and some are not. That, what she said, it's the beginning of this pantheistic relationship with powers, whatever you choose to call them. And that, I think, it's inherent in these stories and in these tales, right? And as far as, the speaking of them or the acting of them, there's kind of a modern and a more ancient approach. When a modern approach is very intellectual, you analyze a script, you break down from what you know of the character, what's their goal, you look at the script, say what's their obstacles, you try to see, okay, so you divide the scene into beats, each beat's a different tactic, what strategy are they using to overcome the obstacle, to obtain the goal. It's a good way to understand the action of the piece, but it's not the ancient practice, which is sort of let the words be spoken through you, be sort of transparent, be a conduit, let the story tell itself through you. And I think what happens is if you don't clutter up the process with a mugging or a bunch of, gestures or too much, if you don't trick it out too much, if you allow the words to sort of live in you as you speak them, the story starts to tell itself through you. There's this almost kind of frightening sense that you're losing control. I mean, you're always conscious, but all of a sudden you realize there's a rhythm there that you didn't quite intend, or the words are saying themselves in a way that you hadn't planned, or there might be an unanticipated moment when you get, as a performer, teary-eyed or choked up that doesn't, quote, make sense. And it's the same thing you feel. Anyone who's done magic will know the same thing. You know, at the very beginning of the rite, you might get this frisson of presence. You're like, well, wait, I haven't even got to the invocation, you know? Halfway through, you might get really scared. And you're like, why am I scared? Nothing's changed. There's been no noise, no weirdness. What is that? Or saying the words, you might feel your throat try to constrict, or suddenly open up, and a voice comes out that hardly seems yours because of its strength, its power. And sometimes you find yourself saying or doing things that seem coming from a far more confident or commanding person. And afterwards, it's hard to even imagine that was me calling upon that power, embodying that space, or whatever. And the same thing happens for a performer. If they can get out of their own way, and if the script, you know, has some substance, I can say when I read through it, if it's going well, I hear just a fraction before I say the words, I can feel the way the words want to be said. And it's kind of like when you're riding a bronco, I imagine. Someone who's good at it can feel the bronco start to twist left before anyone in the audience can see it. And he's already twisting left as the bronco twists. And that's the way he stays on, by not fighting the horse, but moving with it, you know. And I think a good performer's like that with the language. They move with it, and they let the story tell themselves through them. And they always let the language be primary and not secondary or tertiary, you know. And that, it's easy to say, but it's hard to do.
Klara, let me ask you too, because when someone, you know, grabs their copy, listeners check the link below, of Sigrun the Mist, there are these wonderful photographs, and there's a physical embodying of Sigrun that you have gifted Jack's play with, Sigrun the Mist, and perhaps you might have an excerpt to read from that. But not only do you have these wonderful illustrations that kind of almost guide the reader through the book and through different embodying of emotion and scene and scenario and poise, but also in the back of the book, you write about embodying, becoming Sigrun. So can you just share about this amazing process and everything that happened with it and how it interacts with Jack's work?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first, I think we need to just highlight, you know, the incredible process that went into creating these images. These were all created using a technique of photography known as wet plate photography. So this is pre-Civil War equipment, the big giant camera, you know, that she has to throw the black drape over herself. There is no film. These images are printed directly on glass and metal. The photographer, Nicola Hofstikler, who is just incredible, she's working with highly, highly toxic caustic chemicals to process these images. She's putting a gas mask on and grabbing a bottle that says straight up cyanide on it, you know, and it's a dangerous process. So I never expected to see the magic in these images. Really startled me when I saw it, you know. I think just by virtue of the medium, I think there's nothing like that. There's nothing digital about these. But I've spoken about how I read this play many, many times, and it pulled me deeper into my own relationship and paradigm to the Germanic myth. I don't think I could really help it. You know, I began to just, over time, sort of soak and marinate in Sigrun's character. And, you know, I think a lot of that too was that I was nervous. I'd never done anything like this before. So I did spend a lot of time diving into who I thought she was and just feeling around inside her skin. But it sounds so actory. Oh my goodness. You can't just take that off, you know. You know, I would be at my work, you know, which I realized was almost a Valkyric role, working over a body, embalming somebody and helping them move through the process of their own death to the next state. And I did have some very, very powerful, very felt moments where, I felt Sigrun's wings beating about me. I felt changed, and I felt this sometimes, this very stalwart, determined, not an ounce of self-pity, devotion to living out your fate the very best that you possibly can. Even during the shooting, I mean, just, again, I think it goes back to the beauty of this prose. It was in preparing for these scenes. And also, Jack was there directing. There were times where I felt genuinely, emotionally there with this spirit, with this character. I really did. It was a profoundly magical experience. It was long. It was a long day, like 10, 11 hours, but it was an act of magic. And I mean, of course, it also helps that, I have all of my magical and ritual props in these photos. So, I have my staff that I use in Slither work, and, working through my own trance work and discovering my own bind rune to help connect to Sigrun and creating the spear and carving that into the handle of the spear. What can I say? It was a magic ritual. It truly, truly was.
It was truly an amazing collaboration between Klara and Nicola Huffstickler, the photography, who goes by Old Black Kettle on Instagram. She's remarkably patient, and her method, we took probably 14, 15 photos, each one from using equipment 100 years old. Each one took over 35 minutes to produce in hazardous conditions, an exhausting shoot for both Klara and Nicola. But the results, anyone who picks up the book can see these gorgeous photos taken on equipment that was around a few years after the Civil War and captures this old world glamour. You can see both in the artistry, in the equipment, and in Klara's embodiment, references to and an homage to a turn-of-the-century style, in beautiful European photography to capture folkloric figures and mythic heroines, and a deep, deep romantic strain to the art. They all worked together to capture that, and they did it beautifully. I mean, they look like a Wagnerian album cover or something, which is what we were going for. It really was. There was an artistry to every aspect of what they did. And there's a real difference between just someone posing and someone embodying. And I think you can see it when you pick up the pictures. You get a thrill of the uncanny, of the numinous, looking at these embodiments of the character. Added more so by the fact is something that we didn't know when we were posing. Klara has light blue eyes, but something about the equipment made the contacts turn black. So the character of Sigrun in here, if you look, has these absolute, just blacked out pupils that give her an uncanniness that belies the human form. It's a remarkable thing that no one expected, but turned out beautifully and really added to the uncanny aspect of the character.
I don't know if I should say this, but I have done another shoot with Nicola since then, and I wore my contacts again, and I embodied multiple characters in this most recent shoot, and one of them is an angel, and one of them was a mortal girl. And, we had all chalked it up to the contact lenses giving Sigrun these black eyes, but curiously, in this most recent shoot, only the angel had the black eyes.
Oh, no kidding.
And yeah, I was wearing the contacts with both characters, or I would be blind. So,
oh my God, that's amazing.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
If you look at those photos, you'll see soon.
One of the big hangups that people have about ceremonial magic, this is something we've discussed, Jack, as well, is when you look at the materia magica, the magical accoutrement, it takes so much dedication, time, and effort. You have to be the artist. You have to be the crafter, the scientist. I feel that hearing you both describe that with the equipment and with the shoot and with the embodiment, with the invitation for a benign possession, if you will, of Sigrun. I mean, I can feel that. Yeah. Would that be somewhat fair?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
No, it's absolutely real. Klara has a background in fashion, so she brought these fantastic costume pieces, and then we ordered, her character wears armor in here, We knew right away we didn't want some like silver-colored plastic, so we ordered actual armor made by a Ukrainian armorer who forged them to fit her and sent them. So these are actual, the gauntlets and the things that she wears in there. And the spear was the same thing, was made by an armorer. Like these pieces that Sigrun has they're genuine weapons and armor. And the way they catch the light, the steel capturing the reflected light is just remarkable. And it lends, I'm sure it added to, I would think, Klara, you embodying the character, feeling the weight of that actual on you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You just mentioned, Klara, in the embodiment of Sigrun, feeling an absolute sort of lack of pity for herself, of someone who didn't identify as like a victim, despite the fact that she's literally doomed in the old-fashioned sense of the term of having an unavoidable fate that will end, as we all do in a way. But a heroic character often has a geese or a taboo, and they often have a doom in that they sort of know how it's going to end. And part of their heroic journey is living bravely and courageously anyway, even knowing that, someone's coming for them and it's not going to last forever. If you don't mind, I was going to ask you to read the page that you wrote in the magical praxis. I should explain to viewers, there's a hardback limited version of the book. There's several hundred of those. And then there's about 70 some deluxes. And the deluxes are bound in leather. And they're both beautiful. Both of them have the play in them. Both of them have the pictures of Sigrun. Both of them have a wonderful commentary, a long, wonderful commentary by Shani Oates. Both of them have the original folktale in a new edition told by my friend David Coffer, which is wonderful, a rollicking, witty retelling of the tale. And both of them have personal statements by Nicola Huffstickler and Klara. But the deluxe has magical praxis at the end of it that was created by Klara, a statement about the Norse magical praxis she created that's based on invoking and calling forth the spirit of Sigrun, which involves consecrating various tools, doing several wonderful invocatory hymns. I'd love to have her read, if you would, a page where you talk about what you just said, this sense of Sigrun, despite everything being against her and her time running short, never feeling sorry for herself. If you don't mind turning to page, I think it's on 280. I think that really captures what you were talking about.
I believe that Sigrun is a potent spirit for these times. Doom seems to lie particularly heavy on our hearts lately. Many of us constantly feel ourselves to be on the threshold of some sort of collapse, be it personal, economic, or environmental. The world doesn't feel safe. As an embalmer, I spend hours each week rebuilding the fragmented skulls of people who have lost hope and sought relief in a bullet to the head. In the United States, we always know that the next mass shooting is being planned and will soon unfold somewhere completely unexpected. Schools, concerts, grocery stores can turn into killing fields in an instant. Governments continue to enact violence and oppression, which we have an intimate view of from our smartphones. Doom is everywhere. In the air, in our pockets. At night, we doom scroll, a term that resonates kenning-like on the tongue. Doom drifts like an operatic leitmotif in and out of our thoughts. We wake up jaded, and yet also fearful of where we are headed. Each day brings a new Ragnarok. But listen, we have been here before. In fact, we have always been here. Our Germanic and Scandinavian ancestors understood this. The same looming sense of the end is ever present in the ancient sagas and lore, and clearly weighed heavily on the hearts of the people who first sang them into being. It was a central idea that characterized the way that they lived and fought and loved. They knew well that violence and complete devastation could visit their village at any moment. The great and terrible night wolf might swallow the sun tomorrow. They and their loved ones could be cut down in their prime at any time. The only ones with a clear view of the whole thing were the Norns. These uncanny fate spinners were feared and greatly respected. Even Odin's thread was spun, measured, and cut by their hands. Death was a constant. When it came, our warrior ancestors met it without lamenting, the unfairness of it all. In heroic tales, we read of how they mastered their fear without weakness. How many of us can look at our own imminent deaths, that great writhing snake pit that awaits us all, and meet it smiling? Too many of us have lost our fighting spirit. It is easy to succumb to victimhood in this culture. Too many people take firm, heroic stances online, yet live passive, anxious lives off-screen. We struggle with injustice and lament the presence of violence and cruelty in the world as if it weren't an eternal constant. Ragnarok is coming. Ragnarok has come. And Ragnarok will come again. Let us greet it laughing. Let us banish all useless fear. Let us fortify ourselves and meet the oppressors, the enemies, and death with a fierce gladness in the certainty of it all. Let us fight like hell because that is what it is to live. Let us be passionate until the end, instead of spending our days and nights haunting our own homes like defanged draugr. To have breath left in our lungs is victory. How can so many of us give up so prematurely before we've even tried to pick up our swords?
That's fantastic.
Thank
Wow. There's embodying, Sigrun, and then there's putting quill to parchment and writing yourself. You know, as Jack is the playwright, you're penning you're penning this wonderful incantatory call, really, this call from deep in the wilderness. How did you write that? Did that all flow forth in one, kind of as Jack was saying, with his own writing process? Sometimes you got in almost a trance, or how did that come about? That's fascinating.
Weirdly, it sort of did. It really did. It came out of me much easier than many things that I've written. To go back to that feeling when you're out in the wilderness and you're making your way through a landscape and you might have an unseelie feeling or a feeling of dread, and you realize that you're out there alone and that nobody's coming for you and you have no choice but to simply keep walking, and you might feel eyes watching you from the trees, or you might feel the spirits that are possibly ones that you don't want to run into. And all you can do is just keep walking towards your fate. It resonated so much with me. I really, truly believe that way of thinking, for us that do have, oftentimes as artistic, magical people do, we do have more sensitive hearts, those of us that love words and myth and lore. We often are people that have experienced the nuances of hurt and damage and are looking for ways to right ourselves in the world. And this approach of just radical acceptance, you are exactly where you are. Your thread is being spun and cut exactly when it ought to be. So just chill out and go with it. Face it. What else are you going to
do? This leads right into, we have listener questions for both of you as well. And so the first listener question we have is from listener Richard Irving, who is asking for you, Jack, and we have one for you, Klara. So for Jack, Richard says, I'm so excited Jack and Klara are coming on the show. That makes two of us, Richard. And saying, I'm wondering, what is Jack's writing process for Sigrun and the Mist? Did Jack use magical timing? Did he have a routine every day? Anything, Jack, you can say about that?
The timing, as anyone who has other obligations knows, that timing can be a luxury. So, no, I wrote it when I could. I would burn incense, a certain sort of incense that I never burnt before. I would burn when I did that to be sort of a sensual trigger for the work, to get myself in the zone. So I purposely picked out a scent that was different from anything that I'd burnt before that appealed to me. And I would consistently burn that while I wrote. And while it burnt, it would sort of put me in the zone quicker. Because it's hard to get in the zone as a writer, I find. I find it's really quite hard. It took me forever to learn, but it usually takes half an hour of forcing myself to write really intolerable stuff before anything good appears. It's like priming the pump for long minutes before you start to get water. Now, this project was a little easier than some, but it was still that sense of anything you can do to get yourself in a zone, certainly not distracted by phones or other electronics, or to try to pick times when people were not around, and to sit down and promise myself. Sometimes I'd even write it down like 7:30 at night. I'd be like, look, I'm going to write till 8:15. And I'd write down 7:30 and I'd write down 8:15 and say, between these two, there'll be nothing but writing, nothing. And when it's done, you can do whatever you want. But there just needs to be just great for these 45 minutes. And that would seem more manageable. So all those impulses that bedevil me normally, like, well, let's get a drink of water first, or why don't you let the dog out halfway through, or why don't we quickly check our phone and make sure there's, like, all that had to be pressed aside. And then the incense is burned. And then you just give yourself to it. And it seems so basic, you know what I mean? But that's actually hard to do nowadays, to give yourself 100% of your attention to anything. You know, oftentimes, you know, there's a kid in the next room asking for money, and a dog crying to go out, and your phone's beeping, and you're wearing 30 minutes, your favorite shows, you know, something you need to record, something, whatever. Like, it's actually become harder and harder to focus and give your attention to something. And that's one of the benefits. I'll always be grateful. I grew up when I did, where there were long periods of boredom, and you just had to go play by yourself for hours in the yard and lose yourself in the game, you know. And it wasn't just being Gen X, you know, people who were younger, you know, when Klara talks about being largely alone outdoors much of her childhood, you're getting that too. That's when you learn to focus, when you might wait 45 minutes to see if a bird comes out of the nest, when you might go to the same place and wait an hour to see if that deer comes again. It's a different level of focus than someone who's being bombarded, you know, playing a video game for 3 hours. That's a very different thing. And so I can tell you, I felt my ability to focus degrade, you know, by social media and stuff. I can feel it. It's harder. It gets harder daily to write, and it's even harder to read. And I love reading. So I would say there wasn't so much, aside from the incense, any arcane tech, but it just to be able to focus, as everyone knows, it's one of the prime criteria for doing magic, you know, just to be able to focus on one thing and not give yourself over to a million distractions, hesitancies, and insecurities. So that, and I have to be kind of careful when I'm writing what I read, because what I'm reading influences how I write. I'm very susceptible to influence and persuasion. And so I kind of have to read stuff that's adjacent to, or at least complementary to, what I'm writing. So I'm not going to be like reading something that's, who wrote Run with the Hunted? You know, it's Charles Bukowski. Yeah, he wrote, you know, Charles Bukowski wrote, you know, very free verse. And I like Charles Bukowski, but reading that wouldn't help write Iambic Pentameter. What goes in is kind of adjacent to what comes out. And so that I had to be careful of that too.
I want to read your iambic pentameter when you're taking in some Bukowski on the side.
Jack, thank you for sharing about your process. And actually, Richard Irving, for you, Klara, is also asking, I'm curious about Klara's own magical practice and how being involved in Sigrun the Mist altered, changed, or transformed her own practices, or, as Klara says, how she discovered a, quote, cool defiance, end quote, in portraying Sigrun.
I think just stepping into her skin and walking around in it, you know, especially when in my life, I'm working on all kinds of people that have been cut down in every stage and circumstance of their life. That itself issues one a perspective that must be tempered and cooled when you see the reality that death is a constant. Death is the winning team, and all of us are going towards our death.
It's funny. It's like how old philosophers used to have a memento mori on their desk, right? Have a skull to remind themselves you're not, and it wasn't meant to be a gloomy, creepy thing. It was meant to remind you life is short. Live it, and remember to live a life that you'll be content to have lived when your be is up. And I feel like, Klara, like you have a memento mori every day, which really must be your approach to life. If every day I'm sure they're not all 80-year-old people who died peacefully in their sleep, right?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And, you know, I think even my proximity to that, you know, I often think that since working with the dead, that I laugh more every day. and I take more time to just enjoy things than I ever did. The dead have been the best teachers for that. And you can't avoid it. That memento mori experience is very real. And it's why, there are Buddhist monks from various traditions that, as part of their training to, understand simply sitting with what life is, they would watch a corpse decompose or go meditate, on the charnel grounds. It does impart someone with, a very cool understanding that the only thing that you can do when you realize the harsh reality of that is pick up and laugh and enjoy words and verse and make love and, eat delicious things and make magic. It's the only way. I will say, one thing I thought was fascinating was when Jack asked me to be a part of this project, I don't think he really realized that, sort of my native magical home was in the Germanic Scandinavian tradition. I had sort of decided to take a brief respite and jump over into Hecate and PGM because I had been in this northern, very continental, focused on the goddess Hala construct for so many years, so many years. And I got to a point where I just felt like, I needed some outside influence. And by taking Jack's class on Hecate and working with the PGM, and even like I mentioned earlier, reading Peter Jenks's work, it brought me back in the strangest way to square one, to the spirits that I had been working with before. And, I also have to cite Robert Graves and the White Goddess. That was another thing that, we've been revisiting a lot and talking about, that it gave me a much more robust and fuller understanding of the stories and the myths and the spirits that I've been fascinated by and working with since I was a kid. But, suddenly just spending some time with Hecate or the Moray really, really, really deepened my relationship and understanding of the Northern paradigm, which is something that I really encourage people to do, And Jack, I remember at the beginning, I think it's a Hail Hecate, where you tell people, Hecate might not be your final destination. You might not end up being devoted to her forever. And when I heard that, I felt sort of sad, because you think almost like if you don't end up integrating that and mastering this system, it's almost like you failed the class or something. But instead, it just caused me to find this unbelievably beautiful current that flows through, all of these spirit-led traditions of the world and ties together so well with these liminal figures, these psychopompic, the Valkyrie is one, Hecate is one, Frau Hala, the Norse goddess Hela, is one. There's just too much there for it to be a coincidence, And we have so much to gain by stepping outside of our own paradigms for a moment and soaking that up. And even if, you're reading The White Goddess, people can point out all kinds of factual inaccuracies, but just choosing to let yourself loose a little bit and live poetically and lyrically, it can transform your quality of life so much. I recommend it.
I love that you said that. And I want to say, I think you did it right. I totally do. Anyone who takes my class or like whatever, I view Hecate not just as a doorkeeper, but as a door, not as just as a torchbearer, but a torch, not just a key keeper, but a key. I feel like she's the entity we approach to become that which we were meant to be. And for an entity who, for me, embodies liminality, when we pass through that threshold, who knows what it might lead to? I don't think of her technically as like an end goal. I think of her as a portal through which we discover what we need, whatever it may be in our current walk of life. And I think she can do it again and again, and which is why I think she's a wonderful goddess, both for those who want to access ancient magic, work with spirits, do things like that, but also for people who feel stuck, for people who feel trapped, people who feel they're on a journey where they can't see the end, people who feel like they're descending and don't know where the bottom is or how to get back up. People who feel like they need both company and direction, protection, guidance, and to pass through this period to get to what's next. And I think she can be that, both in ways that can lead to like personal transformation in mundane ways, but like what you just described, to discover new strains of spiritual and magical praxis that are exciting and enthusiastic. Because a lot of people's path changes. One thing leads to the next. They may exhaust or explore one system, and then it may lead to another. And many of us are looking like, what's next? Not like in a way of dilettantes, but in a way of like, we need to find a way to stay in love with our lives. We have to find a way to remain passionate about our paths. We have to remain enthusiastic. And so to rediscover magic, to re-enchant our life, to mythify our existence requires kind of constantly finding new ways to see and new ways to hear and new ways to experience and live the myth ourselves. And I think she's good at that. And I think your discoveries are a great example of that journey.
Beautifully said. Exactly.
And I think this leads to the next question, because some listeners out there might be thinking, okay, I'm getting Sigrun the Mist. I love it. This is amazing. It's great hearing both Jack and Klara share about this. So for those listeners out there who do want to jump in, can both of you share some practical tips perhaps about performing Sigrun and the Mist, or anything listeners need to keep in mind if they maybe want to, put on their own production? I mean, any experiences that you have, I think would be great.
I would just say this, because to put on a full production would be quite a deal. But I would say this: it was written to be read aloud. It was written to be read aloud. And not that you'd have to read the whole thing aloud, but if people did have a copy and they were reading it, I would encourage them, if they find a passage they like, or if there's one character that they associate with, or if there's a scene that they find engaging, to go ahead and read it aloud without any concern of, being the world's greatest actor or anything like that. Because when you speak something, when it lives on your tongue, you're literally rewiring the synapses in your brain. You're speaking it, but you also hear it at the same time. There's a current that comes from you and goes into you and connects, sort of like a serpent biting its tail, and something clicks when you say it and hear yourself say it. So I would say, let the words live, let some characters speak it. By doing that, you sort of liberate the book, but you also participate in the book. And, to some extent, a reader always feels a little bit like a voyeur. But when you speak it aloud, you become the character. It's sort of like magic, right? We go through life reading these myths and stories. We read, books of myths as kids. We fall in love with Lord of the Rings. We read the Narnia stories again and again. And there's certain series and collections. And of a certain age, you fall so in love, you read the books 1, 2, 3 times, and you want nothing more than to wish yourself into the story. You want to become part of it. And sometimes there's almost this painful ache that you can reread it again and again, but it never changes and you can't join them. It's like you're separated by a thin glass pane. But magic is a way to enter the story, because by calling upon these gods you read about, by becoming the hero or the magician or the priestess, by engaging and having a relationship with them, your story changes and it includes them, and their story changes too, and it includes you, and you enter into the myth. And to some degree, when you pick up a play or poetry and you read it aloud, you become one with the creator of it, and you also become a character in it, and you sort of embed yourself into the work of art, and it embeds itself into you. That's what I would say. The easiest thing to do if you really want to take it to the next level is just read some of it aloud and let the words live on your tongue.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. There's a reason why, these runes sung as Galder in, these Norse and Germanic charms work without you understanding what you're even saying. They take you into a sub-rational place. And furthermore, I think in ritual, and I would guess in acting too, you hinted at it with burning the incense, but letting your senses live, and picking up something, picking up the strophalos, picking up a spinning wheel. So much of magic, Western occultism nowadays, is about, it's all up here, building a temple in your mind. And just by saying the magical words, just by saying the poem, the nature can be revealed in that inherently. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. You know, like Jack was saying earlier, the word is thoth. Thoth is the word.
I'll give you an interesting example of that. When I did my Godsong year-long course, part of Godsong is every week I read a different chapter of the Iliad, and then we move on to Odyssey, and I read a different chapter of the Odyssey, and we talk about it. And I had read, of course, Iliad and Odyssey the year before I did the course, and I really liked them, and I found it moving. But when I read the Iliad, there's a chapter late in the book where there's one of the warriors is a son of Zeus. His name is Sarpedon, and Sarpedon dies. And when Sarpedon dies, there's a negotiation with the gods. The main point of the negotiation is to try to get the gods to agree to transport his corpse magically back to his home country in Greece, far from Troy, so he can be buried on his own soil. And when I read that chapter, and I didn't even remember that chapter from reading it silently the year before, but when I read it aloud, all of a sudden, to my surprise, my throat closed up and my eyes got hot, and I started to cry. It's on the video, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. I mean, it's moving, but there's every chapter someone dies in Iliad, and Sarpedon's not even a main character. But something about that passage, this idea that even a son of Zeus, the best he could hope for in this world was to be buried in his home country, not to be spared, not to be resurrected, not to be made a constellation, but just to be buried among his own people. For some reason, it was incredibly moving, but it wasn't moving until I spoke the words. And I still don't quite know why, but I know it's true. Even talking about it, I feel kind of moved. Reading it silently, I could appreciate the verse and the idea, but speaking it aloud, to some strange way, I briefly seemed to live it to a degree, and it brought home, you know, the kind of quiet, mundane tragedy of what happened. So it's just an example that, like, you can surprise yourself when you read aloud. Something that was flat on the page might feel exciting or give you an idea or inspire you in a way or move you in a way that you didn't expect. And that's just part of the sort of the magic of it.
I'd love to ask each of you, too, as you were journeying down this, you know, Nordic topography from 1,200 years ago, and as you were really embodying these characters or speaking the lines, incanting the iambic pentameter, putting quill to parchment, all of this whole project, even the chemicals used in the pre-Civil War photographic properties on glass and the almost alchemical nature of that, which was just that was amazing hearing you share about that. With all of it, the entire Sigrun cycle, if you will, what are some of the most surprising things? I'm sure there are many, and you've shared a few, but some of the most surprising things that you either found or discovered or it was impressed upon you in this process, either as a writer, as a character, as a model, as someone embodying a spirit of a character? What were some of the most unexpected things that occurred?
I'll throw out one, which is how collaboration magnifies an effort, right? Because when the play was done, I was proud of it. But if it had just been published by itself, it would have been so much a lesser experience than it is with Klara's photos, Nicola's photography, Shawnee Oates' detailed commentary, my friend David Coffer's clever retelling, the personal statements by everyone involved, the magical practice by Klara, and our good friend Ad Oman did this beautiful cover design that's iconic and really honors the tradition we're going for. But you look at that, that's like 6 different artists collaborating, each in a different way, each contributing different, and the effect, though the book's not a huge one, I really think there's something for everyone there. Like, each thing magnified the next, and each one refracted it in a different way, and each one captured the personality of the person. So the thing was more than the sum of its parts, right? What's the word, the German word, Gestalt, right? Like the thing taken as a whole, it's more than individually what any of the parts were. I'm just so proud of it, and it's not even personal pride. It's just when I look at all the beautiful and talented people that rendered their services to it, it created something much greater than I could have hoped for. So that is a great reminder to me to look for ways to collaborate with people. And I think both spiritually, artistically, magically, often our paths are like lonely. And that, to some degree, is a matter of circumstance. A lot of people grow up practicing quietly, privately, afraid of others judging them, and they just get in the habit of it, or they get burned a few times and they think, forget it, I'll just be a lone wolf. And many people, their spiritual practice is a lone thing, and that is both safer for a lot of people and unavoidable for a lot of people. It is interesting because it reminds me of that quote from the Bible where Christ says, wherever two or more of you join, there am I, which I always thought was an odd saying. You'd think one person invoking him, he'd be there, right? I always thought that was odd. But I think there's a mystery in there that when you actually find a way to do something with another person, there's a third present. And that's kind of a mystical concept too, right? It's almost like that monad, duad, triad, Gnostic and philosophical stuff that whenever you have two, a third is naturally present because the two of you combine and create this sort of a joint self that's created by the two of you and your interaction with each other. And so it's a great reminder, I think, both as an artist and as a spiritual seeker, to look for ways to collaborate with others. It may be a fiasco, but it'll be a great story. And who knows, you might stumble across people of quality that enhance your experience sevenfold, right? Which is what happened here. It's a great reminder to, seek out quality people and look for ways to do things with them because, wonderful things can happen. That's the lesson for me.
Absolutely. I feel honestly like my surprise runs in much the same vein, because goodness, a couple of years ago, I really was practicing entirely by myself and, spending most of my days with completely silent humans, just opening myself up to, this project. I cannot believe what it's become. I cannot believe it. And it became so much more than any of us expected, I think, Even you, in the beginning, I think you thought, how are we going to sell people on a play in iambic pentameter? But it ended up becoming so much more than that. Just this marvelous beast with so many moving parts. I mean, your words are still the heart of it. But, Shani's commentary and again, just working with that photographer, we found so many ways. You talked about setting up the borders of writing within the construct of iambic pentameter style. And in some ways, we kind of chose, I think everyone, these sort of bleak, a lot of times more old-timesy paradigms or media to work with for each component of the book. And that ended up creating, a world that felt so real and vibrant, and that felt so pertinent for the times as well.
I'm curious for each of you, are there any poems? Are there any poets? Are there any specific verse lines or poets that you would like to recommend to listeners or share with listeners? I think that might really highlight the fact that it is an ever-present process. It's an ever-present motion for you.
I'll start by saying, obviously, when you write something in iambic pentameter, people think of Shakespeare, even though he was just one of the playwrights back then that wrote in it. But I would constantly feel I would write something and think, what does that remind me of? And sometimes I'd look back and they'd see, oh, that's like borrowed from this, or that's influenced by that, or whatever. It's very hard, if you do love poetry and poets, it's really hard to get your favorites out of your head. It always kind of lives in you. And when you start to write, it's kind of inevitable, at least for me, to start to write like them. I'll give you an example of that. Maybe you can see the echo of an author in my writing. So I'll read just a couple lines. This is from the beginning of the book, where a king corners Sigrun. He wants her to help him by saving his sons. He sort of teases her. He says, I think you're a thief. And she says, I'm not a thief. She says, You called me a common thief. And he says this following paragraph to explain what he meant. What he's going to describe is that he thinks she stole something, but what she stole was the souls of some bandits that accosted her on the road. So this is the paragraph where the king talks to Sigrun. She says, "You called me a common thief." And he says, "A thief, I said, but most uncommon. You left their gold upon the ground, but took something no mortal takes. The fourth brigand, he who fled the scene, said when the last had fallen, and the lightning ceased to writhe, when the thunder strike had faded, and the clouds released the upper air, she knelt, he said, put out her hand, and drew from each fresh corpse a glowing fog that rose, and when the soul smoke glittered stronger, each in turn she breathed in with a hunger, while her eyes like agates flashed, as if she longed for what would wait no longer, and then into risen spat, and with a wave dismissed the ghost, which mist-like lost both shape and light, and formless then dispersed to join the reaches of the outer night." That's the line from my piece. But listen to this and see if this resonates. I was like, what did that remind me of? And then I remember this. Distinctly I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books a cease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here for evermore. Right? It's got, you can sort of see, you can see the verse fighting against the constraints of the iambic pentameter. It always wants to be 4-beat rhyming couplets. It's like really hard for me to keep it three verse. But once you read Poe, once you read Kipling, once you read, these poets that have such a thumping rhyming rhythm to it, it's really hard to unchain the beat, so to speak. I kept feeling myself devolve back into that. And I love those old poets, but I also love like T.S. Eliot, right? I think he's wonderful. And between those two poles of the older 19th century rhythm stuff and the really early modern stuff, I'd often find myself kind of gravitating back and forth between them. And, it was a privilege to do so.
Klara, what poems or poets or recommendations do you have? What strikes your inner lyre as you go throughout your day?
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't know if I can ever match Mr. Grayle's eloquence, but during this time I did go back and revisit a lot of Wagner's operas, and to just, to highlight, I think, the sort of simple, grandiose brutality of those sounds and words and emotions, to let those wash over me while I was taking in this work was great. But then, at the same time, I found myself rereading Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. There's one sentence that I keep thinking of that seems to be a theme during this conversation where, he talks, how does it go? What is that quote? Beauty is the truest form of genius, or something like that, because it requires no explanation.
Mm.
And so, it invites you again into the sensuality of the art, the beauty of the sounds in your mouth and your ears. It requires no explanation, and that is a form of genius.
To that very point about sharing your experiences, the poets, the art, Wagner and Poe and the influences. I know there are many listeners out there who definitely will be checking out the links below to get their own copy of Sigrun and the Mist. But I'd like each of you to share a little bit about how can listeners support your work, Jack, and your work, Klara. Can you share about any other joint or individual projects or anything else you want listeners to know? I know we have a brief after show to kind of get into some of that, but how can listeners support both of you?
Oh, thank you for asking. I appreciate it. I have a website, jackgrayle.com, and but most of my stuff, the books here, Sigrun and my book, The Hecatian, are available on miskatonicbooks.com. And there's still some of the deluxes left if one wants a leather-bound edition with extra picture of Sigrun in it and Klara's beautiful magical praxis. So those are on miskatonicbooks.com. And I do teach classes at the blackthornschool.com, and that's Blackthorn with an E at the end of it. And I have an upcoming class actually on the magic of the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri called PGM Praxis to the Kingdom, which begins on February 24th. And that one is it's an exploration and an online course that goes on for a year, looking at ancient magical spells that increase our own personal sovereignty, power, authority over ourselves, and way to increase our sphere of influence, in a magical and spiritual way. So that's my latest endeavor. And if anyone wants to join me on it, I'd be more than happy to meet them.
So I am, I think, mostly found right now. I have a website as well. It's under Hexencult, which is HEXENCVLT.com. And I'm also Hexencult on Instagram. And if you tune into either of those places, you can find news about my upcoming publications. I do have a chapbook coming out. I think that's the nearest thing. That is going to be The Maiden Without Hands, which is the first in a series of chapbooks exploring German folklore and folk magical practices through exploring these stories. And, really my goal with that is to put the craft back in witchcraft, which is something that is further going to be reflected in my class that's coming up this spring on Walpurgisnacht or Hexennacht, in which we will be exploring, the myths, the stories, as well as a lot of hands-on praxis that's seasonal, that draws us into the liminality of each season with the folk goddess Frau Halle, who is a liminal goddess in continental Europe.
It's going to be a wonderful class.
I think that's about it. Yeah.
Frau Halle is going to be very adjacent to Hecate in numerous ways.
Very much, yeah.
Anyone who wants to further explore the Hecatian tradition would do well to just sort of experience a class from Central Europe that looks at how a liminal feminine power that's adjacent to chthonic spirits, the dead, but it also has sort of a domestic sphere, was celebrated in folklore back then. It's going to be a really neat class. It's going to be offered on Miskatonic's website as they begin their courses platform. That'll be a really exciting course starting around April 30th, I think.
Jack, we also have a final listener question for you from Frater RC, who is asking and saying, I'd love to know if Jack has done much with statue work or enlivening from the PGM or any other techniques or tips he has to offer.
You know what? One of the best things I recommend when it comes to that, because there are Egyptian opening of the mouth rituals, and in one of my courses, one of the PGM courses, I provide one that's a snippet from the PGM that has an enlivening ritual. And there are some of these, as you know, that often involve creating an idol and then making offerings to it, invoking a god to dwell within the idol, touching it, usually touching its mouth, its eyes, inviting the spirit to speak through it, see through it, hear through it, live through it, and that sort of thing. I always do that with myself a bit. It's part of my ritual praxis with Hecate. I'll touch my eyes and say, these are not my eyes, but Hecate's eyes. See through them. These are not my ears, but Hecate's ears. Hear through them, not my mouth. I do an opening of the mouth ceremony on myself. As, they're meant to bring an idol to life, but I'm actually constantly trying to bring myself to life after a certain age. So I sort of hack that idea and try to apply it to myself. I will say, for anyone that likes that kind of thing, my friend Jeff Cullen in his book Liber Chthoniya has a great description of how to make an embalmer, as using an idol, but then creating sort of a base of the idol, whether it's a pot or a container or something connected to or attached or beneath it, which contains a lot of the materia associated with the idol. And I use that idea. My Hecatian icon has a small pouch attached to the back of it. It has in it a key, it has graveyard dust, it has dog fur, it has serpent skin, it has magnetite, it has different, bit of materia and that sorts of thing that nettles and things like that. I like this idea of attaching to the statue something, the materia that is of the statue, the symbolon, as Iamblichus would have said. And it's not just a Western tradition. In the East, they might have statues of the Buddha with bits of Buddhist scripture in the statue. Sometimes they'll put the bones of a holy monk in the statue to enliven it. Like it's a completely separate tradition, but the principle is the same. The enlivening of the statue is aided by both materia of the dead and the materia of the natural world that is of them. And the idea is you're creating basically a conducive environment where the spirit would want to live. It wants to live there because the things that are of it are all present. Just as you might, if you had a relative coming to visit that you love, you try to, if you had an extra room, fill the room with things that they made them comfortable, knowing who they are based on your understanding of what they like. And so it's very much the same thing. I'll always be grateful for that insight, and I feel like it's a good one.
Author, ceremonial magician, practitioner, teacher of the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri and Hecate, Jack Grayle, as well as Klara Wolfe, occult writer, instructor, model, and practitioner. Their collaboration today, Sigrun The Mist, the wonderful, wonderful play from Jack Grayle, modeled and embodied by Klara Wolfe. So Jack and Klara, thank you both so much. Can't thank you enough for just taking some time and sharing your lovely wisdom on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
I can't thank you enough, Alex. It's such a privilege and such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your time, and thank all of you who listened to this for joining us for this fun talk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been such a privilege.
Oh, I just love that. Invoke the words, listeners. Summon the poem off the page and into your heart. Do it. Embody the ritual and the power, whether as a magician or an actor on the stage. Just two luminaries, Jack Grayle and Klara Wolfe. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you so much to Klara and Jack for taking the time. And check out those links below to pick up your own copy of Sigrun The Mist. And also a huge thanks to each and every patron on Glitch Bottle's Patreon for your support of the show. As always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.